ordnance and military apparatus, that he was outmoded, and he thought that Jackson was the problem with the Army, and he wrote to his member of Congress, did Turner Ashby, "For the last 2 months, I have saved the Army from being utterly destroyed by Thomas Jackson." In fact, 'twas the other way around. Ashby and others were bemused by Thomas Jackson's painfully businesslike persona. Jackson was dour, and he was determined, and he was the most one-idea'd man I ever saw, someone who was near him wrote, and that's not entirely literate, but it's pretty comprehensive. The fact that he was partly deaf contributed to this in dealing with people in any kind of setting. The fact that Jackson couldn't hear half of what was going on added to an already abundant natural inability to mix socially. I found recently his own account of an account out of his mouth at least, of what he thought was wrong with that one ear. All during the war, his staff would notice if there was artillery firing in the distance. He would cock his head one way and the other because he didn't have the balance to hear where it was coming from, and he'd finally say, "Where are those guns firing?" to the people with both ears. Well, I found a memoir by a youngster who'd gone to the Virginia Military Institute, where Jackson was professing, not very skillfully or well by any means, but he was a professor there. And this young fellow, whose name was Marion Elsie, with 2 L's, not like the General Arnold. Marion Elsie had a really sore throat, and he had decided he needed to get his tonsils out, a cadet at the Institute. And he and his 2 roommates were in the room, and there was a knocking on the door, and he went to open the door, and here was Major Jackson, the professor. And Jackson said, "Cadet Elsie?" Elsie had no idea he knew who he was. "Yes, sir. I understand you're about to have your tonsils out." "Yes, sir." He said, "Don't do it. I had my tonsils out, and I haven't been able to hear out of one ear since then." And he turned and left in his usual businesslike fashion. So that's what he thought went wrong with his hearing. That contributed to the inability to get along with his high-ranking subordinates. Far more than that was his just generally stern worldview. He was devoutly religious, really devoutly religious. He believed he was God's instrument in what was going on. Major general who would approach him, a man with a good education, social standing, accustomed to polite society, and would ask him how he was doing that morning and what he thought of the weather, and Jackson would rebuke him for not talking just business. Well, that's not the way the world worked. It's not the way the world works today, I dare say most of you know. An account that has been for quite some while obscure tells about the degree to which the subordinates were sure that Jackson was going to lead them to disaster in the valley. Brigade commander commanding a brigade from Louisiana, probably the best brigade in the Army at that point, was Richard Taylor. Taylor was about as well connected as any man could be. His father had been president of the United States, Zachary Taylor of Mexican War fame. Dick Taylor was his son. His brother-in-law was the president of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis. Dick Taylor's sister had married Jeff Davis, his first wife. She died early on. So with those connections, Dick Taylor, whose book, Destruction and Reconstruction, is a great classic. Some of you may have seen it. Beautifully written, highly literate, descriptive of Jackson. Doesn't say anything about this, but a memoir by one of his staff says that Dick Taylor, when he first came in contact with Jackson, was so put off by him, so sure that he was a disaster waiting to happen, he got on his horse, rode over the Blue Ridge Mountain, down through Piedmontane, Virginia, and went to Richmond to see his brother-in-law, Jeff Davis. And he said, "You've got to do something. We have a crazy man over here, and it's an absolutely crucial theater. You've got to send a replacement." He came back with the conviction that he had persuaded his brother-in-law, Jeff Davis, to make a change, and that Davis was actually going to send James Longstreet over to take over the command. That did not happen, as you know. If it had, Longstreet would just about be closing on Winchester now. He was not known for fast marching or aggression by any means, but that shows the degree to which there was uncertainty about Jackson amongst his subordinates. When the campaign had built to its towering crescendo, Jackson's success spread throughout the South. They'd been hearing about Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh and Island Number 10 and all the riverine successes of the United States Navy. And now suddenly here was good news from Virginia, the first good news from Virginia by a very wide margin. And the letters that started flowing home from the soldiers, not in Jackson's command, they were all pleased to have been part of these triumphs, needless to say. But first of all, the rest of the army around Richmond, which was languishing in the swamps, not particularly well led by Joseph Johnston initially. Here's a soldier who is in Toombs's, Robert A. Toombs's Georgia Brigade, writing home to Mama. The news of the gallant achievements of Stonewall Jackson have been most enthusiastically received by the army here. Jackson is quite unpleasantly commented upon by the rank and file in comparison to their own leaders. He is the only general on our side who has real capacity, or who is fast ascending the ladder of fame. Well, his own military chief, Robert Toombs, would never be confused with the reincarnation of Bonaparte, but even so, almost everyone was saying this. Remember the 11th Virginia, not in Jackson's command then or ever. No personal propinquity here, just an onlooker. Jackson is the man. I wish we had an old army filled with Jacksons. Yankees would soon be shipped from our soil. The thousands of accolades to Jackson fill the contemporary letters. It's become a little bit popular in the anti-Confederate writing in today's world, largely in academia, to insist that neither Lee nor Jackson were popular during the war. They were artificially, Machiavellianly created post-war heroes when such heroes were needed. Anyone who believes that has not looked at the contemporary material, which exists in millions of pages. An example of that war-dated zeal, a fellow named James Cooper Nisbet, who was a captain in the 21st Georgia during the Valley Campaign, went on to become colonel eventually, and well after the war, wrote a book which is quite well known, 4 Years on the Firing Line, and it's full of all sorts of encomiums for Jackson, and they would be dismissed as late life musings generally. But in fact, his contemporary correspondence, which has turned up, is at least as enthusiastic as what he wrote later. Here's something he wrote home to his wife on June the 15th, the last battle of the campaign. That's today, in fact, 150 years ago he wrote this, 6 days after the last battle was over. Jackson is like old Frederick the Great. He makes our fights at the right time and in the right place. We are ready for, we all feel that whatever he does is right. His soldiers all love the old fighting cock. And a key point that I would make for you today is the impact of this attitude, which Jackson had earned. Even if he didn't earn it, that's a somewhat subjective call. Everyone was impressed on both sides, and the subsequent ripple effect, I think, is enormous. In human affairs, there is no prophecy remotely as successful as a self-fulfilling prophecy. People engaged in mortal combat, people playing football, people playing cards, people chasing love, succeed far more often when they think they will succeed, and fail far more often when they think they will fail. And Jackson's troops thought they were going to win, perhaps at least as significantly. His enemies got afraid of him and thought they were going to lose. People who had never heard of Thomas Jackson in April, wearing blue uniforms, by June were writing letters like this. This is June the 12th, 150 years and 3 days ago. A lieutenant of artillery from New York State says, "No one in our army is fit to compete with Stonewall Jackson." Well, is that true or not? Well, probably, given the configurations of the federal command in the Valley. Doesn't matter so much whether it's true or not as that he thought that. No one in our army is fit to compete. That's a pretty telling comment. Down near Richmond, where Jackson went, starting 150 years ago, day after tomorrow, went down to help lift the siege of Richmond. It got lifted. He failed. Jackson failed notably, comprehensively around Richmond. His only failure of the war. But it's impossible. People have tried to rehabilitate and fumigate his activities around Richmond. I don't think it can be done, although I'm something of a Jackson fellow. He had failure after failure there. I've concluded that the old original interpretation is still the right one. I found a lot of new sources and produced a chapter about what happened to Jackson in late June of 1862. I call it Sleepless in the Saddle. What he had done is he had used himself up. He was diligently doing his duty as he saw it, like he always did. He rode back and forth from the Valley to Richmond several times, We don't know when he slept, but we can document when he didn't sleep, and it was almost all the time. And he was suffering, apparently, from some permutation of stress fatigue. He had just used himself up. And the Confederate success in pushing McClellan away from Richmond during the 7 days, late June of 1862, was not as comprehensive as the newspapers wanted. Those days, the newspapers knew better than anyone else what to do. Yeah, we have some of that yet today, from what I can tell. But when they complained about not gobbling McClellan up and capturing his whole army and not reaping all of the fruits of victory, they blamed Lee and not Jackson. And in fact, it was almost entirely Jackson's fault. A quote from that campaign, which is just about my favorite, is from a boy from Vermont who was in the 1st United States Sharpshooters, and writing soon after the campaign, not after the war with the hindsight that gave. He talked about what happened around Richmond, and he said, "We saw the dreaded form of Stonewall Jackson lurking in every bush." Well, if in fact Jackson had been lurking in a bush, it would have been to take a nap because he was exhausted. He wasn't really a threat. But they didn't know that, and the effect was just the same anyway. A Indiana soldier who had a little bit to do with the valley, then came over toward Richmond, he wrote home at this point, called Jackson this great leader. He has outgeneraled everyone on our side. That's probably true, but once more, it's more important for what it means later. Later in 1862, to my delight, a United States Army court-martial tried a quartermaster named Sims. He had been brought to trial for treasonable language and sedition. And the documents survive at the National Archives, the testimony, and this fiend was proved to have said, "Every time we fight Stonewall Jackson, he whips us." And for saying that, he was cashiered from the Army. What kind of scoundrel could believe something like that? A very literate Pennsylvanian, he wrote before the war and after, very thoughtful chap. He was worried about it. He said, "I am sorry to say, I have frequently heard our men talk as though they believed Jackson could not be whipped. He has gotten to be what might be called a bugaboo, even larger than life." It's a pretty useful thing to have going for you. The high-ranking subordinates who had been so uncertain about Jackson before the campaign came around, some of them, and some of them did not. You will recognize Dick Ewell's name, Richard Stoddard Ewell, who was from D.C. He was born in D.C., lived in D.C., went to West Point, became a Confederate Corps commander. He was, were it possible, more eccentric than Jackson. Ewell was a funny creature and prone to say exactly what he wanted, but he said to a subordinate, with the Valley campaign half over, he said, "Jackson is as crazy as a March hare, a crazy man." He wrote home to his niece about Jackson's damn foolishness, called him a, quote, "enthusiastic fanatic," which is not really far wrong, depending how you defined your terms. But then, as the campaign was ending, Ewell called Colonel Tom Munford aside on a road. He said, "Colonel, do you remember when I called Jackson an old woman?" He said, "Well, I take it all back." Not all of them were as convinced as that, though, even after all this success. Charles S. Winder was commanding Jackson's old Stonewall Brigade from Maryland. Charles Winder delighted Jackson. Jackson thought he was perfect for the job. Jackson did not delight Winder, and Winder's diary survives in Richmond. And he was telling his diary on the night of June 5, 3 days before the two climactic battles that would end this incredible campaign. June 5 in his diary, quote, "Jackson is insane." 2 days later, on the eve of the first of those two battles, disgusted with Jackson. The night of the 8th, the night between those two last battles, I am requesting to leave his command. That's one of the most important officers in the Army. He never got away. He was killed at Cedar Mountain exactly 2 months after he wrote that last entry in his diary, still in Jackson's command. The triumvirate who probably had played the most important role below Jackson in the campaign gathered together after the campaign was over and talked it over. Doesn't appear to be any sedition in any of this. They were reviewing a mighty historic event they'd been involved in. This is to say Winder, Trimble, Taylor, and Tolliver. The four of them talked it over, and they agreed that Jackson had had so much luck that they were afraid next time it wouldn't work. They were still not entirely convinced. Sam Fulkerson, the fellow I mentioned to you a bit ago, the colonel who was writ large on the mutiny note, the complaining note, but was Jackson's favorite, he wound up writing home in an unpublished letter, a manuscript letter, which is kind of interesting. Not exactly sure what this means. He'd been somewhat beyond unsure of Jackson, and yet he wrote home to his family, to his mom, not long before his own death.